afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan's sister, Lizzie. On behalf of all of Susan's family, I'd like to thank you for taking part in this celebration of her life. We do hope all of you who are here will sign the guest book, which is over on that side of the hall. We knew and loved Susan as our sister and aunt, and I'd like to share a little of what we remember and cherish about her. Susan's move to Berkeley in the early 1970s was literally and figuratively crossing the Continental Divide, a turning point in her life. Most of you got to know her after she made that momentous crossing, but she had brought some important things with her, things that helped her to flourish personally in Berkeley and to contribute in quiet but substantial ways to the emerging disability rights movement. She was born 80 years ago into a devout Catholic family of 7. She was a loving and kind big sister. She contracted polio in 1955 when she was 17. When the disease had run its course, she was quadriplegic. I asked her a long time ago about how she had felt about acquiring her disability. She said she cried and cried for a while, and then she just stopped crying and moved on to whatever was next. Our parents, Frida and Joe, came as close as they could to keeping family life as it had been, bringing to bear on the enormous challenges they faced their steely determination, practical mindset, a deep well of humor, and love. Perhaps these traits remind you a bit of Susan. There was never any question in their minds that Susan would graduate from college and become self-supporting. Such expectations about people with disabilities were unheard of in the 1950s. But Frida and Joe saw their daughter as intelligent and capable, and that made all the difference. Mom became Susan's principal caregiver. Dad, an engineer, worked with the nuns to set up an intercom between Susan's high school, Nazareth Academy, and her hospital bed in our dining room. It enabled Sue to graduate with her class. He built a ramp into the house and a first-floor bedroom with an accessible sink. No one told him how to do this. He figured out on his own what made Susan's world accessible. Encounter a barrier, find a way to fix it. A fundamental principle driving the independent living movement, which hadn't been born yet. Susan got her liberal arts degree and then her master's and began working at Nazareth. She was immersed in what she loved all her life: history, the French language, and working with young people. She was a careful thinker, never one to rush to judgment. Once she organized a panel of speakers with diverse points of view on the then ongoing Vietnam War. She was astonished at the angry reaction from some of her colleagues, a few of whom stopped speaking to her. Apparently they did not recognize the possibility of more than one point of view on the issue. That kind of thing, of course, would never happen today. She made numerous trips to France. Other countries too, but France was her first love. She considered Paris the most beautiful city in the world and returned to her beloved Cathedral of Notre Dame over and over. She was entranced by the rose window in the north transept and the sculptures on the western facade of the dead rising on Judgment Day. We used to giggle at the ones who had been wicked as the lip-smacking little devils dragged them off to the flames. Along the way, Susan acquired substantial experience in foreign travel as a wheelchair user, which she shared in a number of published articles. Susan took on the world with grit, but the barriers can grind you down. One day she was trying to get into an event, and as usual, the facility staff didn't know what to do with a wheelchair. They said she was a fire hazard and offered her a spot where she couldn't see the stage. I heard her say, "I am sick and tired of being treated like a second-class citizen." Wow, I thought, she's really mad. The righteous anger began to clarify for me how ignorance and stereotypes strip people both of their dignity and their rights as members of the community. My mother had tried all kinds of approaches to getting help with Sue's personal care. Nothing really worked. Mom was almost 60 years old and she was deeply worried. Our parents saw no other future for Susan than a nursing home. At that point, I had been accepted for grad school at faraway, vaguely dangerous sounding UC Berkeley. It was disconcerting when both my parents begged me to go to a school within easy reach of home in case I was needed. I said no. I just didn't want to make that sacrifice. As it happened, my selfishness was the stuff of miracles. Soon after my arrival on campus, I saw with awe the ramps into so many buildings, the curb cuts everywhere, and most astonishing, the college kids zipping around in their motorized wheelchairs. Hey, I called out, where did you get that chair? Where do you live? How do you manage? That night I called Susan, and nothing was the same after that. The seeds of meaningful access to higher education for students with significant disabilities had taken root at Berkeley. A small group of students lived in a wing of Cowell Hospital on campus. Improvements in physical accessibility on campus and the surrounding community, a plentiful pool of students willing to work as attendants, and the availability of those empowering motorized chairs were the foundation for their liberation. And already those revolutionary concepts were being adapted to life in the larger community. Susan was intrigued. She decided to try a summer session on campus in 1971, using supports from the new Physically Disabled Students program. Not without misgivings. The idea of living in a hospital with a bunch of disabled people left her a bit queasy. Sounds kind of sterile, right? Well, I invite all of you to read Sue's hilarious description in her archived oral history interview online of life in the Cowell dorm. Somebody knows about this. Half a dozen young guys and one young woman doing all the things college kids do, including the stuff they shouldn't. Susan was a 33-year-old teacher in a Midwestern Catholic girls' school. In theory, she was there to take some university courses. I doubt she remembers what she learned in the classroom. But she certainly remembers her encounter with the world of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Her comrades thought she was unique and fascinating. She thought they were pretty funny. By the end of that summer, she was a skilled motorized wheelchair user, crossing busy streets at the curb cuts. She had confidence in her ability to hire the attendants she needed, and she had found a community of change makers. She says she cried on the plane all the way back to the Midwest. Others today will share with you the consequences of Susan's decision to permanently leave behind life in the Chicago suburbs. She brought with her one more gift from my parents, their full confidence in her ability to make choices that were right for her. Not everyone is lucky enough to have that gift, and for young people with disabilities, it's especially important. This was the message that Susan later carried into the homes of young people with disabilities stuck in their parents' back bedrooms. Who could be a more convincing messenger than someone with her experience? Sue earned an essential place in the history of disability rights, but she described that place to me in modest terms. No, she was not the firebrand, the path breaker like Ed Roberts. She was in the battalion that followed the prime movers like Ed. Perhaps a little older, generally from a solid middle-class background, educated, hungry for solutions, and ready to strengthen the fragile new system of supports for independent living. You'll hear more about her role shortly. Susan loved the Bay Area, and her social circle was large. She was especially fond of young children, and they gravitated to her. When she was left almost completely debilitated after her surgery for cancer in 2014, it was painful for all of us to mark the irony that someone who had worked so hard to free young people from the back bedroom was now stuck in her own back bedroom. Fortunately, at this point, people came to her. Her busy social life was a tribute to the riches of her mind and the goodness of her heart. Last February, my daughter brought her family to Berkeley for a visit so that her daughter Kira and son Evan could get to know their great aunt. As they were heading home, 10-year-old Kira asked her mother, "Will we see Susan again, Mom? I want to see her again." "I do too, Kira. We all do." And now we'll be hearing from Zona.
I have to call that. I am not used to using it.
We can't
But I'm
hear
going
you.
down.
Get to the
You have to
microphone.
use the mic.
Is this better?
Yes.
Is that a good place to be? Is this a good place to be? That was so good to hear from Liz, though. And because my memories of Susan are quite a few. But what I remember mostly was when Liz came out here to take a course at Berkeley. And she came into our office at PDSP, where I was working behind Top Dog with a big ramp, very illegal ramp up the back, as anybody could remember. And Liz came in and she said, "My sister has to see this place." She was just so white about it, you know. I was thinking this morning and I thought, what would have happened if Liz hadn't come out here for the course? I don't know anyway, but it was worth it. Susan arrived and she made her way in Berkeley, of course, and she joined our staff for a while at PDSP and was a good, I don't have too many remembrances of what she did there because Susan is so kind of complete unto herself and very organized, which I'm not very, so I always appreciate organization. But I think some of the things that she did around the office were very stabilizing for our office too, because we're a strange crew. But we were doing good work. And then the next big memory I have was when I saw her at Debbie's wedding. And I said, how did that condo, because she was living in an apartment on Ellsworth, she needed to move on. And I said, how did the condo thing go for you? And she said, oh, it fell through. So I told her about a place, later I told her about a place on Eaton that was eventually that worked out. So she got to meet my good friend, my neighbor, and Susan. So I would visit her sometimes, and probably not often enough. Susan was a very quiet person about herself, but she loved gossip. She wanted us to come in and talk about what we were doing. So I would go down there to find out how she was, and all she'd do was find out how I was and what I was doing and what was exciting. And for a while before she had to be in her back bedroom, she sat in front and watched the street. So she would tell me gossip, not about herself, I understand, just about. And for my birthday, Susan gave me these beads that were put around my waist, and there were some left over, so I had them put around my ankle. And so I said, oh, I'll learn how to belly dance, and I'll come down and belly dance for you with these around my waist. Well, it turned out I had more belly than dance, so I really got to entertain her with that. But what a dear friend Susan was. And the street is not the same. I miss you, Susan. But thanks for her lovely family, and it's great. Thank you.
I'm so glad that Zona could make it here tonight, but she's a hard act to follow. My name is Dan Baedeker, a longtime friend of Susan and the O'Hara family. In 1968, 50 years ago, I moved into a garret apartment on Ward Street, about 4 blocks north of here. For my food shopping, I walked 2 blocks down to the old Berkeley bowling alley, which had become a cavernous fresh produce store with 2 checkout stands. I walked past a house with a large front window through which you could see a young man in an iron lung. Then I began seeing him in a motorized wheelchair with a special breathing apparatus working his way toward the Berkeley campus. I discovered that he was a fellow graduate student in political science and that his name was Ed Roberts, after whom this amazing facility is named. I could not imagine how he could possibly cope with the demands of note-taking in very large lecture halls, participation in long and competitive seminars, and endless research papers. I did not know at the time that his chief attendant was his mother, Zona, who has become a lifelong friend. And now fast forward 10 years, and I was introduced to Susan in her Ellsworth Street apartment by my good college friend, Janice LeRae, who was her cousin. In talking about our various family connections, we discovered that our mothers were both born in 1912, a day apart, and that they had gone to the same small Catholic girls' high school, Loretta Academy, on the south side of Chicago. But since Susan's brilliant mother, Elfrida, had skipped a grade in grammar school, she was in the class ahead of my mother, Winifred. They had never actually met each other until many years later at Susan's home on Eaton Avenue, and it was quite a chatty and laugh-filled reunion. When I broke my knee in 1979, Susan's Ellsworth apartment became the destination of my daily crutch walking routine. A favorite diversion of ours was competing at Scrabble. More than once we had to play on a card table in the lobby while waiting for the unreliable elevator to be repaired. And more than once, Susan was carried up the stairs by burly football players who lived in the building. A major mobility breakthrough for Susan came with her purchase of an antique blue Dodge van with a very noisy back lift. Quickly named Bessie, she was temperamental and required lengthy warming up. We never knew how she ever passed the smog test. Susan reveled in taking Bessie to the theater, opera, ballet, and even occasional accordion festivals. She readily traveled far afield for family weddings and gatherings of friends. Susan's wanderlust extended to Europe, where she visited numerous times with caravans of assorted family and friends. We shared a passion for medieval architecture, and besides great cathedrals, she sought out ancient churches in remote parts of rural France. Many of them were what are now called romantic ruins. At one of these rock piles, a sibling was heard to mutter, "And why does she want to see this?" After one of these trips, Susan persuaded me and our intrepid photographer friend Susan Fox to present a slideshow at UC entitled "The Iconography of the Facade and Entrance Portals of Notre Dame Cathedral." Before the days of PowerPoints and SmartCams, this was a major undertaking. And surprisingly, about 100 of our loyal friends and family attended, and many graciously pretended that they actually enjoyed it. The ultimate tribute to Susan is the very large number of people she has brought together to create a fuller and richer life for us all. First, she shared with us her amazingly generous family, whose energy and irrepressible and wicked sense of humor enlivened us all. Secondly, she shared her unstintingly devoted friends and attendants who made her independent life possible. Thirdly, she shared all of you, wonderful compatriots in the disabled community. You have shown us that the disability movement is not a small private interest group making onerous demands upon the able-bodied majority. You have made us realize that sooner or later we are all disabled. My favorite quotation from St. Paul is, "Encourage each other daily while it is still today." Susan taught us how to do that.
Hello, do I have this right? I'm Ann Wade, and I'm here today first and foremost as a friend of Susan's for more than 25 years, which I'm finding is rather a short time to be a friend of Susan. But since our friendship grew out of a close collaboration at the Regional Oral History Office at the Bancroft Library, we call it ROHO, I've been asked to speak today about Susan's many contributions there. In her quiet way, always giving others the credit, it was Susan who played the leading role in bringing about and shaping the acclaimed Disability Rights and Independent Living Movement Oral History Historical Project at the Bancroft Library. Let me explain how it happened. In 1982, when Susan was heading the UC Residence Program for Students with Disabilities, she approached Willa Baum, ROHO's director, and made a compelling case that something of great historical moment had happened and was continuing to happen on campus and beyond. This has got to be documented, she urged. Willa agreed, and the long struggle to find funding for a disability rights oral history project ensued. It was difficult going. Few people then were thinking about the disability movement in terms of its historical significance. If you remember, 35 years ago, only a very few historians or social scientists recognized disability as a fruitful field of study. There were no major oral history projects underway. Susan's vision was ahead of its time. Multiple efforts for grant support failed. The National Endowment for the Humanities turned down ROHO applications 3 times. And we did no better with other grantors. But Susan did not give up, and I think this is a hallmark of her quiet but very persistent ways. By the mid-1990s, the time was right. Susan was alerted to a new program at the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research that might be interested in our project. Susan and Mary Lou Breslin joined with ROHO to convince the Bancroft curators of the project's value. Their persuasiveness resulted in a successful grant application for an oral history program focusing on California activists, this time including an important additional component for Bancroft to acquire, preserve, and make accessible the personal papers and archival records of the activists and their organizations. 4 years later, with the second NIDA grant, the project moved nationwide, recording interviews and collecting historical papers of leaders of the movement in Massachusetts, New York, Washington, D.C., Illinois, Texas, and other centers of activity. As the project got underway, Susan played a key role at every step. It was a key role, but often a hidden role. I was the project coordinator for ROHO, so I know better than most how important she really was. Under the guise of her position as historical consultant, she advised on every aspect of the project. I have to say, I didn't do anything without consulting with Susan first. She helped the Oral History Office realize how important it would be to staff the project with interviewers from the disability community who would have the trust of interviewees and organizational leaders whose memories and papers we were collecting. With her help, we brought people you probably know on board: Sharon Bonney, Kathy Cowan, David Landis, Mary Lou Breslin, and Denise, where's Denise? Denise Shear Jacobson, on board to carry out the interviews as members of our staff. Susan herself conducted 14 oral histories for the project. As we expanded to the east, we added a couple of Easterners, Fred Pelka, Jonathan Young, and later Esther Ehrlich, who's out here, did a project on artists with disabilities. Susan helped us navigate the difficult task of selecting interviewees. Some of them recognized leaders and founders of organizations, some of them less well-known builders and sustainers of the movement, or simply well-placed observers of key events. I see many of you out there today. Susan was also a graceful writer and a keen editor who had a hand in all the project grant writing, publicity, and website materials. So it gives me really great pleasure that although we've lost Susan, we have tangible evidence of her lasting legacy in these areas. If you look on the internet, for Drillin. You'll find the project website. You'll find 114 in-depth oral histories and guides to an extensive collection of archival materials from disability organizations in the Bay Area and beyond. You'll also find a record of Susan's early life and her many other contributions to the disability movement in her own oral history. One of many invaluable sources, all widely consulted by researchers, students, and community members. So I say thank you, Susan.
That's right, thank you. We really like yellow tulips because Susan really loved yellow tulips, so we got a lot of them around today.
Can you make that better?
Sorry?
Much
Louder. Louder, okay. There we go. How's that?
better.
All right, great. So, hi everybody. My name is Mary Lou Breslin. I met Susan in 1975 when we were both working at UC Berkeley. She was running the Disabled Student Residence Program, and I was running the Disabled Students Career Planning and Placement Program. I really only knew her casually then as we passed in the hallways of her office above Top Dog. So a lot of people here remember that office, as Zona mentioned. The famous grungy hot dog shop in Berkeley that wafted sauerkraut fumes up through the floorboards. It was only later that we became fast friends and she influenced my life in untold ways. So my journey fully into Susan's orbit began when she called one day and asked if I would be interested in attending a yoga class at her house. I scratched my head because I really hadn't been thinking very much about yoga. But I said, okay, sure, and I came for the class and stayed for about 10 years. Well, not really doing yoga for 10 years. But the yoga class led to dinner afterward, and eventually dinner turned into what we laughingly called the salon. Those of us from the original yoga class and a few others began having dinner together every Wednesday night at Susan's house. The group grew and shrank over the years, but the core diehards remained until health and other factors intervened. The salon was an exuberant force in my life that brought joy at so many levels. See, everybody else got through this but me. I don't know, it's not fair. Okay, Susan graciously hosted week after week with various of us bringing food or sharing cooking duties. Conversation ranged far and wide, as you can probably imagine, but inevitably over time we not only developed a deep appreciation for one another, we also came to know the ultimate details of each other's lives, and that itself was one of Susan's gifts to us. The salon spawned Christmas parties, birthday parties, events for friends, flying the Danish flag for our friend Camilla's birthday, and many, many, many meetings over many, many years about the Bancroft Library disability history that you've heard about. Susan was so gracious and welcoming and so thoughtful about all of us and our idiosyncrasies. She seemingly effortlessly indulged our small and not so small pleasures, noting carefully the things we loved and liked, which would appear in birthday gift bags and on no occasion whatever other than for the pleasure of it. Her home felt more like home to me than any other except my own. So, of course, Susan's eclectic tastes also infiltrated my life. I'm pretty sure I never would have seen the Lipizzaners perform had it not been for my relationship with her. So, for those of you who are not equine fans, Lipizzaner is a breed of horse closely associated with the Spanish riding school of Vienna, where they demonstrate highly controlled, stylized jumps and other movements known as the airs above the ground. Who knew? So off we go to the Oakland Coliseum to watch these magnificent animals show off their remarkable skills. It's also highly unlikely that I would have come to love Paris as I do had it not been for Susan. I can draw a direct line from her influence to that affection. And then there's the Betts Award. This was a prized cash award made annually by Dr. Henry Betts, the famous rehab doctor in Chicago, whose generous philanthropy for many years acknowledged disability rights activists around the country. Rightly or wrongly, Susan was determined that I should be chosen for the award, but her desires were roundly thwarted, at least initially. So she nominated me 3 times. Each time she was more determined than the last to have her way. In the end, I think she just beat them into submission. And they finally selected me. So right after I was notified that I'd been chosen, somebody asked me, who was the first person I told? I said, well, obviously it was Susan. Her advocacy and the subsequent cash that came as a result of it spurred our first conversation around her dining room table about a trip to France, which had become suddenly possible. Speaking of the table, for those of you who spent time with Susan in her home, you will recall her oval table nestled comfortably in her dining room alcove. I had my designated spot at that table, which gave me a perfect view of her detailed bird's eye view map of Paris. I can't remember who suggested it first. It might even have been me. But before I knew it, we were planning a trip. As momentum built, more and more people were signing up to come along. As Dan mentioned, Susan's family was well represented by siblings and nieces and nephews, and the ever-growing group including many good friends. Longtime Francophile Susan and Dan were preeminent tour guides, bathing us in Parisian history, architecture, and arcana, and tales of monarchs and revolutionaries. Susan plotted our itinerary down to the absolute minutest detail, and Notre Dame of Paris by Alan Tempko was required reading. But the ebullient dinners and gatherings and expeditions to plays on Sunday afternoon, wonderful as they were, don't really begin to capture the extent to which she deliberately brought me into her orbit, and as time went on, how much we came to share with one another, both the ridiculous and sublime aspects of our lives. It's difficult to adequately describe how deeply I enjoyed and appreciated her vitality, her brains, her wicked humor. Seems like everybody's saying that same phrase, wicked humor. But perhaps most memorably, her careful probing attention to and interest in the details of my life and work, as Zona had mentioned. And I know perfectly well this was her MO with everybody who knew her well. I see some nods out there. So finally, because Susan eschewed the spotlight, her disability rights advocacy is not always known or readily evident. She fussed mightily when the city of Berkeley created a Susan O'Hara Day, yet she profoundly affected not only the life trajectory of individuals, especially students at Cal, but as a trustee of a charitable foundation, she also helped direct funds to Bay Area disability and aging groups that met her and the foundation's high standards. She also made an invaluable contribution to future scholars by championing disability oral histories, as Anne has talked about. Thus far, at least 2 scholarly books have been published that rely heavily upon those original records, and another is in the works that is aimed at a broad general audience. She never sought or desired accolades for any of it, yet she has left an indelible mark on the arc of the disability movement. I'm really proud and honored that she was my friend. Thanks.
I think I'm the only one who kept to the lead. So this is going to be short. The first time I met Susan was 16 years ago when I was applying for a job as her attendant. She later said it was the only interview she ever conducted where she felt she was being interviewed too. That was probably true. I wanted to size her up while she was checking me out. Lucky for me, I was hired. As time passed, I seldom felt like an employee because we had so much in common, including our sense of humor, our Midwestern background, and our Catholic upbringing. She considered herself well-rounded, a little skeptical. She didn't think she had any creativity, and she had a big dose of no-nonsense. The last part was left over from her teaching days. Through the years, we developed a certain rhythm to our mornings. The initial good morning, including followed by a Werther's, which is a brand of hard candy to moisten your mouth in the morning. Recently, in the past couple of years, when laying out materials, as Susan needed more, as she was in bed more, there was more to do. When laying out the materials for the bath, we couldn't wait to discuss the articles or the news things on TV. We laughed, we cried. Politics was a lot lately. We were in the same frame of mind, and we grieved. Susan was well-grounded. She knew exactly who she was, what she was comfortable committing to, and what just didn't fit. There is a stability in a personality that is anchored in knowing oneself. Skeptical, of course, yet she didn't expect others to see things in the same way. For example, she didn't believe in magic, the fae, the paranormal, or fantasy. Yet when I wrote my first manuscript about magic, the fae, and urban fantasy, she wanted to read it. She had a high standard of what good writing consisted of, and I was shy about her seeing my work. The next thing I knew, and this is an image that comes back to me again and again because it happened at more than one point in my life. But the next thing I knew, she was coming up over the hill and in her chair, just the wind blowing her hair. And we spent the rest of the afternoon under an umbrella on my driveway because the house wasn't accessible. And I read the entire thing to her, word by word, because I really didn't want her checking out my punctuation. She stuck with me. She did help with the punctuation as we went on. And she went through it with many iterations. When we started out, the heroine was 11 years old. When the book was finally published, she was 17. So she was my biggest fan. It was easy to offer my hands, my arms, my legs in any way she needed. I think all of her attendants felt the same way. Over the years, I tried to explain to her that she was very creative. One of the ways she used that creativity, and I've heard this mentioned before, was when she gave gifts that fit the person she was giving to. Her goal was to give something personal to the receiver, and she thought about it a lot. She was always on the lookout, and she always knew who she was going to give it to. She admired her sister's ability to share witty gifts and aspired to make her gifts witty too. She had 2 rules about gifts. The first was that whenever giving a birthday gift to a child, every other child in the family needed to give too. Her other rule was that Christmas gifts should not all be saved for Christmas. Planning a party was something that brought her great pleasure, and most people don't know that her greatest unfulfilled desire was to work as part of the ground crew for the airplanes. She also liked to watch big machines, cranes especially, the bigger the better. Arranging for a crane to lift an iron lung through the 2nd-story window of student housing when she was at DSP was a peak experience for her. I was always proud to be her attendant because I knew I would be part of a wonderful team. During my years of employment, I saw lots of attendants who came for a while and moved on as their life unfolded. She had certain requisites: chemistry, attention to detail, and transportation. Reliability and the ability to wade in and get the job done, whatever the hiccup in her routine happened to pop up. She had a big regard for people who did that. There was an indefinable ability in her hiring interesting people from all cultures and walks of life or levels of education. We had doctors, nurses, linguists, writers, artists, Jills of all trade. She'd had attendants from just about every nation in the world, and they all had one thing in common: compassion. Because Susan loved people, she loved interesting people who did things she had never done, who were faced with problems and pursued dreams that she had never experienced. She surrounded herself with people she enjoyed being around, and she admired loyalty and was ferociously protective of her people, even amongst the people. Susan was one of a kind for sure, and attending her always left me feeling like I had gotten more than I had given. We joked about our mornings, included a lot of laughing, and it gave us our oxydose for the day. oxy being short for oxytocin. In the brain, oxytocin acts as a chemical messenger that influences human behaviors, including recognition, trust, and closeness. It lowers anxiety and helps with pain. Laughter releases oxytocin and is often called the empathy hormone. A little laughter goes a long way. Whatever the technical reason, Susan and I enjoyed a lot of oxy. And from what I could see, she had a similar relationship with her other attendants. Because of Susan, I felt I was part of a great and worthy team. Most of all, she was a beloved friend who had my back and made me want to have her back too.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leah Bro, Leah Susan Bro, actually. Damn. It's all right, Mom already ruined my makeup. I'm Liz's daughter, by the way. Okay, given Susan's preference for the French language, she always chose to address me as Nièce, and I, of course, called her Tante. We called each other by these nicknames ever since I was in high school and started studying the French language. And about 15 years ago, she took me on that rather infamous trip to Paris to really seal the deal. And I don't think Merrick or I are ever going to forget that trip. I cannot work under these conditions. I'll be in my trailer. We are all here today to celebrate what Tante meant to each of us and to so many other people who aren't here. However, there are a number of people who meant so much to her over the years, and especially recently. So my family has asked me to take just a few minutes now to thank some people to whom the O'Hara clan is particularly indebted. I'd like to say that they really wanted to close with the strongest speaker, but that's obviously a lie. I personally think no one wants to get up here and get weepy again, so you're stuck with me. Since all of Susan's siblings live far away, it has been a real challenge to get her affairs in order. My Aunt Peg and my Aunt Kathy were able to be here for about a week after her death, and they scrambled to get as much done as they could. They had lots of help from many wonderful people, but they want to extend special thanks to Rod McBrayer, who cheerfully lugged what has been estimated to be 8,000 pounds of Tante's household possessions to appropriate places. So thank you, Ron, wherever you're sitting. I lost you in the crowd. There. Peg declares that she simply could not have managed without your help. As you may know, Susan's health steeply declined after her release from the hospital in mid-May. Her sister's greatest concern was that she not be alone, and how to get her that extra support was a very worrisome question. My cousin Ann O'Hara, upon learning of the situation, dropped everything, her job, her family, other obligations, and flew up from Long Beach to spend a week with Susan, whom she called her West Coast mom. When Tante could no longer write her name and the banks gave her a really hard time, as Merrick said, Ann got them sorted on that. Susan's siblings remained completely overwhelmed by this generous sacrifice. So thank you, Annie, wherever you're sitting. Know that Susan loved you deeply. Heartfelt thanks also go to Virginia Miller, Susan's devoted friend and caring neighbor upstairs. How many times over the last 25 years, Virginia, did you jump up and run downstairs to turn off a malfunctioning security alarm, respond to a late night health emergency, or otherwise play the general role of fixer in a pinch? You have our profound gratitude. Please join us also in obviously thanking Mary Lou Breslin, Susan's dear friend and comrade in arms in the battle for disability rights. Susan's respect for Mary Lou was immeasurable, and it was to her that the family turned for help in putting together this beautiful celebration of Tante's life. That's good. Give me a second. We will walk away from this event with full hearts and peace and joy in generous measure because of your kindness, Mary Lou. Okay, this is where I'm going to totally lose it, so I'm just warning you ahead of time. All right, and now we turn to 7 women who saved Susan's life every day. I knew it, day after day. Okay. Robin, Randy, Ulrika, Amanda, Mira, Christina, and Salam. We call you angels, and so you are. Following Susan's surgery in 2014, she became permanently bedridden. For someone with a significant disability, this is a perilous situation, requiring especially attentive care by attendants. These 7 extraordinary women showed up faithfully, month after month, and took on the complexities of Susan's health issues with cheerful devotion. From the first turn of the lock in early morning to the final "Good night, Susan," after dark had fallen, there was no question that Susan was receiving the highest quality of personal support that in turn provided her with the best possible quality of life. If, as she approached age 80, Susan was still able to enjoy an evening of fine dining and uproarious laughter with friends, to participate in board of directors conference calls, to watch really bad TV with her old pal Rob, to giggle when the Blue Jays attacked the neighborhood cat, and to peruse the internet for just the right present for a grandniece, it was because of Robin, Randy, Ulrika, Amanda, Merrick, Christina, and Salam. Please stand up, ladies. Because we heard laughter like birdsong behind Tanta's bedroom door, we thank you. Because you came even when it got so hard, we thank you. Because you were there with your wisdom and your quiet presence as Tanta slipped away, we thank you. We call you angels. Susan called you friends. Thank you. All right. No, I made it. I'm good now. I'm gonna yell at my mom for making me do this. Okay, thank you also to everyone who is here today. Your presence is the most meaningful tribute to Tanta's life, and we, her family, are so grateful for it. Please feel free to stay and enjoy some food, drink, and conversation with friends, as this is the conclusion of our program. Thank you.
All right.
That could have been more graceful.
Everyone else will believe it. That's just some videos getting out. No, you're
I mean, I'm not. No, I mean, I'm not.